The dropship's ramp was already grinding shut when Staff Sergeant Naomi Calder saw the guard detail push Vereth Sky Ilven back down onto the tarmac at rifle point. And by the time she had her hand on the ramp release, the deck crew had already locked it from the flight deck. "She's still out there," Naomi said, not loud, because loud wouldn't do anything on a strip crew that had already made its decision. "Cut the lock." Negative, Ferry. The load chief didn't even look up from the manifest board. Steward's office flagged her non-manifest an hour ago. "We are wheels up in 90 seconds. Through the narrow strip of armored glass in the ramp door, Naomi watched the Ashkar Queen get a rifle stock in the shoulder blades for trying to stand, watched the carapace plates across her collarbone flare a hot, furious orange and then dim fast, the way a coal dims when someone closes a hand over it. Vereth didn't cry out. She never did in the 6 weeks Naomi had spent shuttling relief convoys past her palace gates. She just went still, the way something goes still right before it breaks. The dropship's engine spooled to a shriek that ate every other sound on the pad, and the strip lights fell away beneath them. And the last thing Naomi Calder saw of the Ember Queen of the Ashkar Dominion was 2 Regency Guard troopers dragging her by the arms toward the black mouth of the Cindermere Works, back into the refinery that used to smelt Heartstone for a court that no longer existed. That had been 11 days ago. Naomi still hadn't decided whether the 90 seconds the load chief promised her had actually passed, or whether some part of her was still standing on that ramp, watching. 6 weeks before that, she had watched the same woman stand in the Ember Gardens, receiving a coalition relief convoy in person, waving off her own honor guard so she could walk the supply line herself, and ask each driver's name, crouching without a flicker of self-consciousness, to help a human loadmaster half her rank restack a pallet of grain crates that had shifted in transit. Getting her own court robes dusted with a shipment's worth of coalition, packing chaff and laughing about it, in a way none of Naomi's briefing materials on Ashkar court protocol had prepared her to expect from a reigning monarch. Naomi had thought, without particularly meaning to, that this was not a ruler who governed from a distance, and had filed the thought away the way she filed everything, without knowing yet that it would matter. When the coup broke 3 days later, Regent Corvath's household guard seizing the palace overnight, the official broadcast citing a fabricated assassination plot that put Vereth under arrest before dawn, Naomi had been the one flying escort on the convoy that got caught outside the palace wall when the gates sealed, watching from 100 meters up as a government she delivered grain to a week earlier came apart in real time. Watching new insignia go up over the east gate before the old ones had even finished being taken down, and radioing back to Compact Joint Command a report that would sit, unread by anyone with the authority to act on it, for the better part of a week while the treaty desk worked out what the new government was worth to the coalition's fuel supply. She was thinking about the coldom of Vereth's carapace, and about the Ember Gardens, and about the first time she had stood in First Steward Koss's office 3 days after the coup asking permission to at least confirm the Queen's status through diplomatic channels. A request Koss had denied then too, on the reasonable, infuriating grounds that any inquiry at all would signal coalition interest in Vereth's fate, and complicate the treaty talks already underway with her cousin's new government. When Koss told her for the second time in 2 days that the matter was closed. The matter, Koss said, was closed the moment the Regency signed the Cindermere Accords. "You should be pleased, Sergeant. The Accords guarantee Heartstone shipments to 4 coalition fleets for the next standard decade. That is not a small thing to set against one woman." Koss was Thren, a species built long and narrow, all vertical lines, with a voice that came out of a throat ridge rather than a mouth and always sounded, to Naomi's ear, like it was reading from a card even when it wasn't. She stood behind a desk that had never once, in Naomi's 3 visits to this office, held a single loose paper. Everything about Ilvara Koss was filed. "She's not dead," Naomi said. "You know she's not dead." I know that Regent Corveth Ilven's government has formally reported her Ember Queen cousin killed during the transition, Koss said. I know that our own intelligence assessment rates that report as unconfirmed but plausible. I know that the alternative, a coalition combat team crossing a sovereign border 6 days after we signed a resource treaty with that border's government, to retrieve a rival claimant to its throne, would end the accords, strand 4 fleets without fuel stock, and hand every skeptic in the Compact Assembly a case study in why the coalition cannot be trusted to keep its word for a week. I know all of that, Sergeant. What I do not know is why you keep asking me the same question with different words. Because the signal wasn't unconfirmed, Naomi said. I decoded it myself. You decoded a heat pulse anomaly that Compact Signals Directorate rated 11% likely to be a deliberate transmission and 89% likely to be residual thermal bleed off a damaged reactor core, Koss said. I have read your report, Sergeant Calder, twice. It does not change the calculus. It changed everything, Naomi thought, but she'd already had this argument twice with someone whose job was specifically built to be unmoved by it. She had spent 4 years training to read exactly this kind of signal, the almost nothing, the signature buried under noise that everyone else's equipment threw out as garbage, because that was the whole discipline of combat rescue, not walking into open ground where the wounded were easy to find, but reading the 11% that told you someone was still alive in the place everyone else had already grieved. The pulse she'd caught off the Cindermere district 3 nights ago hadn't been random. It had a rhythm, 3 long, 1 short, repeating on a 40-second cycle, in a facility whose reactor had been cold for 11 days. She knew Ashgar physiology well enough to know what a body did when it modulated its own carapace heat to send a signal instead of screaming, because screaming brought guards and a slow, deliberate heat pulse in a dark cell did not. She had learned that discipline the hard way, 4 years earlier, on a colony evacuation on Marrow Station, when a structural engineer with 20 years of seniority on her had stood over a set of seismic readings from a collapsed dormitory shelter and told the assembled rescue teams flatly that the survival window for anyone still inside had closed 9 hours earlier. Naomi had been a probationary technician then, 11 weeks out of qualification, and she had watched a senior corporal named Itzel Reyes argue for 40 minutes that the shelter's ventilation baffles were rated for a longer window than the engineer's model assumed, and she had watched command side with the engineer's seniority instead of the corporal's math, and she had said nothing, because she had been junior enough to believe that saying nothing was the same as staying in her lane. The shelter had been reopened 9 days later, once the rubble field around it was finally stable enough to clear for salvage rather than rescue, and a different unit had found 4 bodies where the models had predicted 0 survivors, and 2 of those 4, the recovery log noted in the flat clinical language such logs always used, showed tissue evidence of having been alive for at least 6 of the 9 days command had already written off as certain death. Naomi had read that log alone, in a supply closet, because she hadn't been able to make herself read it anywhere someone might see her face while she did. She had never told anyone what she'd decided, sitting on a crate of trauma dressings with that report open in her hands, except that she had decided it privately and completely. She was never again going to be the technician who accepted someone else's 90% as if it were 100. She did not tell that story to people. She carried it instead, the way her instructors had told her a good rescue technician was supposed to carry every failure, not as guilt to perform, but as a standing correction to her own certainty, a reminder that 11% was not the same number as 0. "Ma'am," Naomi said, "with respect, I didn't come here to change your calculus. I came here because regulation requires me to formally request retrieval authorization before I file a dissent. I'm filing the dissent." Something in Koss's long face did something that on a human would have been the ghost of a wince. Noted, "It will change nothing." "It's not for you," Naomi said. It's for the record. She left the steward's office with the taste of it still in her mouth, walked the length of Compact Joint Command's administrative ring past windows that looked out over a landing field full of aircraft going nowhere, and detoured on the way back to her billet through the medical wing, where a coalition xenobiologist named Dr. Priyanka Sethai had spent the last 3 days. At Naomi's request, and against no explicit prohibition, anyone had bothered to write. Working out exactly what a starved Ashkar body needed to survive extended cold death onset. Best I can build you is an analog, Sethai told her, holding up a sealed vial of dense gray compound against the light. Ashkar ember drafts are mostly a silicate mineral suspension their own biology processes into carapace heat. I've matched the mineral profile as close as our stores allow, but I can't promise it stabilizes someone who's been without intake for longer than 12, 13 days. Past that, the crystallization in the extremities isn't just cold anymore, it's structural. The tissue itself starts changing state. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand there's a clock. I'm telling you there's a clock nobody's written down anywhere, because nobody with the authority to write it down is treating this as a live rescue. Sethai held the vial out. I can't authorize you to use this. I can hand it to you and not ask what you plan to do with a compound I logged as a general trauma kit restock. That's the most cover I can give you, Sergeant. It's enough, Naomi said and took it. Group Captain Myril Ondach was waiting for her in the corridor outside operations when she got back to the flight line, arms folded, wearing the specific tired look of a commanding officer who already knew exactly what her sergeant had just done. You filed the dissent, Ondach said. Yes, ma'am. You know, a formal dissent goes into your permanent record. Every future promotion board reads it. It reads forever, as this soldier disagreed with a lawful order from Joint Command on a matter of high strategic sensitivity. Yes, ma'am. Ondach studied her for a long moment. She was coalition regular, career officer, the kind of commander who ran her wing tight and clean and had never once, in the 18 months Naomi had served under her, given an order she couldn't defend to a review board. That was exactly why Naomi hadn't told her anything else. Ondach couldn't authorize what Naomi was about to do. But she also, Naomi had noticed, hadn't asked the follow-up question a suspicious commander would have asked. Hadn't asked what Naomi planned to do next, now that the dissent had gone nowhere. Carry on, Sergeant, Ondach said finally, and turned back into operations and didn't look back, and Naomi understood that as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. I am not going to watch you closely enough to see what you do tonight. Corporal Yusuf Aldana, her junior partner on 11 joint retrievals, found her in the hangar first, 20 minutes ahead of Brandt, drawn there by nothing more than the fact that her billet light had never come on and his own instincts about where she'd go instead. He stood in the hangar doorway watching her lay out a trauma kit that was 3 items heavier than standard issue, and didn't ask the obvious question, because he already knew the answer and asking it out loud would have made him complicit in a way silence didn't. I'm coming, he said instead. No, you're not. Naomi didn't look up from the kit. One person can move through that facility without being seen. 2 people double the noise and double what gets found if this goes wrong. And you've got a kid at home who needs you to still have a career in 6 months, Yusuf. I don't. That's not fair to decide for me. It's not about fair. It's about who's expendable to the mission and who isn't, and I already ran that math before you walked in. She looked up then because he deserved that much. If this goes the way I think it can go, 1 reprimand is survivable. 2 careers gone over the same bad night isn't a rescue, it's a waste. Go back to your billet. If anyone asks, you were asleep and you don't know anything, and that's going to be true, because I'm not telling you the rest of the plan. He held her gaze for a long moment, jaw tight, and then he reached past her, wordlessly, and adjusted the strap on her trauma kit where it had been sitting crooked against her shoulder, tightening it the way he would have before any sanctioned mission, and left without saying anything else, because there was nothing else honest left to say. Chief Warrant Officer 4Els Brandt found her in the hangar 40 minutes later, elbow-deep in the undercarriage of a Kestrel-class light shuttle that had no earthly business being flight-checked at this hour, and he didn't ask what she was doing. He just leaned against the strut and said, "Cindermere's under a no-fly directive, compact-wide, signed this morning." I read it. Then you read that it's not a request. I read that too. Brandt had flown medevac out of 3 different war zones before he'd ever set foot on a coalition flight line, had the kind of face that had stopped registering surprise a long time ago, and had once, 8 months back, flown Naomi's team into a downed convoy under active fire because the standing order said wait for air support, and he'd made the calculation that the wounded wouldn't survive the wait. He hadn't been court-martialed for that. He'd been quietly commended because it worked, because the mission report could be written afterward to make the math look clean. Naomi was gambling that this was the same kind of man twice. There's a woman in a cold cell with a body count clock running on her own species biology, Naomi said. Ashkar go into cold death without mineral intake, carapace crystallizes from the extremities in. They call it the ember going out. She's been down there 11 days without an ember draft. I don't know her exact number of hours left. I know it isn't many. And First Steward Koss said no. First Steward Koss said the accords matter more than one woman's life. She's not wrong that it's a hard call for her to make. She's wrong about which side of it is right. Naomi wiped her hands on a rag and looked at him straight on, because she decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to talk anyone into anything with a speech. I'm not ordering you into this, Els. I'm asking you to fly me to a drop point 8 kilometers outside Cindermere and then hold station off-grid until I call for exfil, or until sunrise, whichever comes first. That's it. If I don't call, you go home, and you never heard this conversation. Brandt looked at the shuttle for a long moment, at the open panel, at the tools laid out in a neat line the way she always laid them out, methodical even when everything else about the last hour had been reckless. You're going in alone. I'm going in alone. That's not a rescue plan, Sergeant. That's a funeral with extra steps. I've read the facility schematics. Old refinery pre-coup construction. I flew relief runs past it for 6 weeks before the transition. I know the access points better than anyone else on this base who isn't Ashkar. I have 4 years of training in exactly this, finding one signal in a dead building and getting one person out of it without being seen. That's the job, Els. It's always been the job. I just usually get to do it with a wing behind me. And when the wing finds out you went without them, then I answer for that. After she's out. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to say no, and she'd already started composing in her head the version of this where she stole a shuttle herself and flew it badly and probably died in the first 15 minutes doing it, which was a worse plan than any version that included Els Brandt. Then he pushed off the strut and reached for the tool rag she'd set down. "Pre-flight's not done," he said. "Get out of my undercarriage and let me finish it properly, or we're both going to die because you rushed the fuel line seal." They lifted off 2 hours before local dawn, running dark, transponder scrubbed, on a flight plan that Brandt had logged as a training circuit through empty airspace 40 kilometers from anywhere either of them was actually going. Naomi sat in the jump seat behind the cockpit with her gear laid out across her knees in the same neat rows she'd used since her first deployment. Trauma kit, thermal imager, breach tools, Sethai sealed vial, the compact signal decoder she'd built the case for out of a salvaged Ashkar heat sensor, and a coalition field processor because nobody else's equipment could read Ashkar biosignal the way hers could. And she did not think about the promotion board, or the descent already sitting in her permanent file, or what Group Captain Ondat's face was going to look like when this came back to her. She thought about the 40-second cycle, 3 long, 1 short. still alive when she'd caught it 3 nights ago. She had to believe it was still alive now, because the alternative made everything about the next 6 hours a different kind of mission, and she wasn't ready to plan for that one yet. The Cindermere district came up out of the dark like a wound that had scarred wrong, a valley of old refinery stacks and slag heaps, and the bones of a mining operation that had once fed the whole Ashkar, court its heartstone, now lit only by the intermittent flare of a Regency Guard patrol light sweeping the perimeter road. Brant put the Kestrel down in a dry wash 2 kilometers short of the fence line, low enough and fast enough that its heat signature would read, to anyone watching, as a rockfall settling. 8 kilometers to your primary breach point, he said. I'll hold here. You call, I come. You don't call by 500. I make the decision I make. Understood. Naomi. He said her given name for the first time in the 18 months she'd known him, and it made her stop with one hand already on the hatch release. Whatever's down there, come back out of it. That's the job, she said, and dropped into the dark. The 8 kilometers took her 90 minutes on foot, keeping to the drainage cuts and slag shadow, moving the way her training had taught her to move through hostile ground, never in a straight line, never at a constant pace, stopping every few hundred meters to read the thermal imager for patrol heat and the ambient dark for anything that moved wrong. Twice she went aground and let a Regency patrol truck grind past 40 meters away, its spotlight raking the wash bottom without finding her, because she had built her whole career on the specific, unglamorous competence of not being found until she chose to be. The Cindermere Works itself rose out of the valley floor like a dead thing that hadn't finished falling down, 6 stories of refinery housing built around the old smelting core, most of it gutted by the coup fighting. Its east wing collapsed into a slope of rubble that the Regency hadn't bothered clearing, because nobody was supposed to be interested in an unused refinery anymore. That collapse was Naomi's way in. She'd flown past this building for 6 weeks before the transition, cataloging it out of habit the way she cataloged every structure she flew near, because you never knew which building would be the one you needed to get into fast someday. She remembered a maintenance shaft that ran from the collapsed wing down into the old smelting sublevel, sealed but not guarded, because the Regency's planners had assumed, correctly, until tonight, that no one sane would climb down into a half-collapsed refinery basement to look for anything. The shaft grill came away under her breech tool with a shriek of corroded metal that seemed, in the dead quiet of 300, loud enough to wake the whole valley. She went still, counted 60 seconds, heard nothing but wind moving through broken windows 4 stories up, and lowered herself into the dark. The sublevel smelting floor was a cathedral of dead machinery, vast crucible housing standing cold and black under a ceiling lost in shadow. A biometric hatch stood locked across the only clear route toward the building's older sections. A Regency addition, newer tech than anything else down here, meant to keep looters or salvagers out of whatever the Regent's people still valued in a facility they'd otherwise abandoned. Naomi crouched in front of it for 4 full minutes, running her thermal imager along the frame until she found what she was looking for. A faint residual handprint, still cooling, left by whichever trooper had passed through it last. She matched the imager's read to her decoder, fed it the palm geometry, and coaxed the lock into believing it had just been opened correctly by someone with clearance. A trick that worked on exactly the kind of hardware a mining company installed to keep out scavengers, and not to keep out someone trained to read heat the way Naomi Calder had spent 4 years learning to read it. The hatch side open on hinges that, mercifully, someone had oiled recently enough not to scream. Beyond it, moving between the crucibles with her thermal imager throwing faint ghost heat off every cooling pipe and dead conduit, she found the service stair at the crucible bay's far end, its door hanging half off a broken hinge, and beyond it a lower level she hadn't known existed from the old schematics, not refinery infrastructure at all, but a row of cells cut into the original bedrock, The kind of holding block a refinery only needed if it had once also served as a labor prison. Back before the last Ember Queen's grandmother had outlawed indentured mining a century ago, the Regency hadn't built this. They just remembered it was here and reopened it. A guard station sat just inside the block's entrance, a converted foreman's office with a bank of old mining-era monitors repurposed to watch the cell corridor, and it was empty at this hour, its single-duty chair pushed back as if whoever had last sat in it had left in a hurry and not come back to straighten it. Naomi almost walked past it. It was the kind of room her training told her to clear fast and leave faster, because control rooms meant cameras, and cameras meant someone watching a feed somewhere else in the building, and every second she spent in one was a second she was visible to anyone who happened to glance at the wrong monitor. But a data slate sat charging on the desk beside the monitors, its screen still lit, and habit, the same habit that had cataloged this building's exterior for 6 weeks before she ever needed to break into it, made her glance at it on her way past. It was a supply log. Ordinary, tedious, the kind of document nobody bothered to encrypt because nobody imagined it would ever matter to anyone outside the facility's own quartermaster chain. It listed, in a guard captain's flat administrative hand, the standing ration and mineral draft allocations for every occupant of the holding block, cross-referenced against an authorization code at the top of the page that Naomi didn't need her translator to identify as belonging to Regent Corvath's own household seal. Beneath the Ember Queen's prisoner designation, in a column marked simply intake, someone had entered a single instruction 11 days ago and never updated it since. Suspend, pending further order. No further order had ever come, because no further order had ever needed to come. The withholding wasn't an oversight buried in some junior guard's negligence. It was signed, dated, and traceable in 4 keystrokes to the same household seal that had signed the Cindermere Accords 2 days later. The treaty first steward Koss had just told her, an hour ago and 200 kilometers away, was worth more than the woman starving under its own authorization code. Naomi copied the log to a data chip the size of her thumbnail in 11 seconds, the same 11 seconds her training had drilled into her for exactly this kind of opportunity. Take the evidence. Don't stop to feel anything about it yet. And slid the slate back to exactly the angle she'd found it at, and moved on, because the corridor beyond the guard station was still dark and still hers only for as long as no one noticed anything out of place. She would not let herself think until much later about how deliberately ordinary that single word on the screen had been. Suspend, not kill, not execute, a patient man's murder, exactly as Verath would describe it to her within the hour, committed in the bloodless language of a supply log nobody was ever supposed to read again. The first 2 cells she passed were empty, their manual bolts drawn back, their floors scored with the kind of long, fine scratches a claw or a carapace edge left when someone spent days pacing the same 3 meters of stone. One held a heap of Regency-issue restraints, cut through rather than unlocked, and a dark stain on the wall at chest height that Naomi made herself look at directly for exactly as long as it took to confirm it told her nothing new, and then made herself stop looking at, because grief was a thing she could carry after the mission and not during it. Whoever else this block had held before tonight, she was not going to find them alive. She kept moving, jaw tight, boots silent on old stone, until her handset's screen lit with the signal clean and close. Not the faint, filtered echo she decoded from orbit, but the real thing now, a distinct pulse rising through the floor. 3 long, 1 short. She found her in the 3rd cell, behind a door with a manual bolt and no guard posted, because 11 days into a cold death countdown, the Regency didn't think Verath Sky Ilven needed guarding anymore. They thought she needed nothing anymore. That was the calculation Naomi had flown 200 kilometers on a stolen flight plan to prove wrong. The Ember Queen of the Ashgar Dominion was sitting upright against the cell's back wall, knees drawn in, and in the green wash of Naomi's low-light optics or carapace plates. The ridged, segmented plating that ran from her collarbones down both forearms, the plating that on a healthy Ashkar burned a deep, banked orange like coals under ash, had gone the color of cold slate, dim all the way down, except for one narrow strip across her sternum that still pulsed, faint and deliberate. 3 long and 1 short, 40 seconds and then again. She didn't startle when the bolt scraped back. Her head came up slow, deliberate, a queen's economy of motion even now, and her eyes black, faceted, catching the low light in a way human eyes never did, fixed on Naomi with an assessment so immediate and so sharp that for a moment Naomi forgot she was looking at someone who was dying. "You are not Regency," Verath said. Her voice came out rough, unused, but it did not shake. "And you are not Coalition regular either, or you would have brought more than yourself, which means you are here without authorization, Sergeant Calder." Naomi's own name landed like a small shock. "You remember me." "I remember every human who flew relief past my palace for 6 weeks. I remember which ones looked at the ground and which ones looked at the people." Verath's dim plates shifted, a flicker of something that might, on an Ashkar, have been the equivalent of a dry, exhausted almost smile. "You looked at the people. That is why I kept transmitting after the 11th day, when logic said I should have stopped and conserved the last of my heat instead. I gambled someone was listening who would care what an 11% probability meant." She held up one hand, and Naomi saw, even in the low light, that the fingers were going the gray-white of true cold death, crystalline at the tips. "You should know before you decide anything else. I am not worth what your coalition traded for me. 4 fleets worth of fuel is not a small thing to set against one queen with no throne left to sit on." "That's not your call to make," Naomi said, already moving, already unpacking the thermal blanket and Sethai's compound from her kit. "It's not the steward's call either, with respect. It's mine and I've made it. You will be court-martialed. Probably. You will end whatever career you have built. Maybe." Naomi got the blanket around Verath's shoulders, checked the crystallizing fingers, started the compound feed with hands that had done this exact motion, stabilize, assess. Don't waste words on anything that isn't the next 30 seconds, more times than she could count, though never once before on an alien physiology she'd only ever studied from a report. "You want to talk me out of it, or you want to tell me the fastest way out of this building before your regent's guard does a headcount and notices somebody's cell has a broken bolt." For the first time, something that was unmistakably a real smile moved through the queen's ruined plating, faint as a match struck in a hurricane. "Corvath was my mother's sister's son. He grew up 2 doors down the Ember Garden's east wing, and he spent 30 years watching a throne he believed the succession law had cheated him out of by nothing but the accident of which of our mothers was born first. Ashkar succession does not follow strength or ambition, Sergeant. It follows a birth order registry kept by court clerks 1,000 years dead, and no amount of competence or patience or careful, quiet grievance was ever going to move Corvath's name higher on that registry than mine. He knew that his entire life. He built a coup instead of a legal case, because a legal case would have failed, and a coup, if it succeeded quickly enough and looked orderly enough afterward, would not need to answer to the registry at all. He is not a monster in the way your coalition briefings will describe him, Sergeant. He is a careful, patient, entirely rational man who has convinced himself that patience is the same thing as virtue. He did not order me killed because an order leaves evidence, and he is too careful for evidence. He simply stopped sending Ember drafts to a locked cell and let my own biology do the work his conscience would not let him order directly. That is the whole of his crime on paper. Nothing. A withholding. A patient man's murder. "Then let's make his patience useless," Naomi said. "There is a maintenance conduit behind the old assay office, 2 levels up, that the Regency does not know exists because it predates their grandfather's grandfathers. I had it built myself, 12 years ago, as a way to move through this refinery unseen when I still had reason to visit it as queen and not as a prisoner. Its surfaces outside the perimeter fence, in the slag field east of the collapse. I can walk you to it blind, Sergeant, if you can keep me on my feet. I can keep you on my feet. Then let us discover, Verath said, gathering herself upright with a control that cost her visibly, and that she did not let show in her voice, whether your coalition's calculation about the value of one queen was wrong. They made it 200 meters before the first patrol, 4 Regency troopers walking aboard, routine circuit through the old assay corridor, and Naomi pulled Verath into a stairwell recess and pressed a hand flat against her own chest. Wait, don't breathe loud, until the patrol's boots faded back the way they'd come. Verath's whole body had gone taut against the wall beside her, not from fear, Naomi understood, watching the queen's dim carapace in the low light, but from the specific, grinding effort of staying upright and silent at once while her own biology was actively working to shut her down. Every minute on her feet was a minute she was spending against a ledger that had already run 11 days into overdraft. They made it another 150 meters before the second. A 2-man team stopped directly outside the alcove Naomi had chosen, close enough that she heard one of them complain, in the flat, bored cadence of every bored soldier in every army she'd ever operated near, that Regent Korvath's promised bonus for the coup's completion still hadn't cleared, and the other answer that bonuses always cleared slower for line troopers than for the officers who'd actually planned the thing. And Naomi filed that complaint away without meaning to, because it told her something Kasa's briefing packet hadn't. This occupation was thinner than it looked, held together by promises that were already fraying at the edges. Verath, beside her, mouthed something Naomi didn't catch until they'd moved on. A name, one of the 2 troopers' names, murmured with the specific bitterness of someone recognizing a face that had once sworn a household oath to her own mother, and was now grumbling about back pay 2 corridors from the cell that oath's absence had left her dying in. They made it 400 meters through the old maintenance level before the alarm found them, not tripped by anything Naomi had done, but by the simple, unavoidable fact of a headcount at shift change. A bored guard walking a cell block that was supposed to hold exactly 1 prisoner and finding the bolt drawn and the cell empty. The klaxon that rolled through the Cindermere works a moment later was a sound built to be heard through solid rock, and Naomi felt Verath flinch under her supporting arm in a way the cold hadn't made her flinch once. They will flood every corridor between here and the assay office, Verath said. There is no version of the direct route that does not put us in their patrol pattern. Then we don't take the direct route. Naomi was already pulling up the mental map she'd built on the walk down, every junction, every dead end, every place her thermal imager had shown a draft that meant an unmapped opening. Talk me through the conduit's layout while we move, every junction, every choke point. If I know it as well as you do, we can improvise around whatever they throw at us. Verath did, in short, economical bursts between breaths that cost her more than she let show. And it was that, the Queen's own knowledge of her own prison, delivered under a cold death countdown with the same flat competence Naomi brought to her own trade, that got them past a third sweep, 6 Regency troopers pounding down across corridor 40 meters away, while Naomi and Verath pressed into a service alcove Verath had known was there, and Naomi never would have found alone. It got them past a fourth, a fire team methodically clearing the assay office itself, when Verath's whispered correction sent them down a half-flooded drainage line instead, cold water to the knees, moving in a silence that not even Naomi's training could have managed without a guide who knew exactly which stretch of pipe carried sound, and which one didn't. Naomi's boot caught a submerged length of rebar in the dark, and she went down hard onto one knee, felt something tear along her shin, bit down on the sound before it could leave her throat, and kept moving, because stopping to assess an injury in a flooded pipe 40 meters from a fire team was a luxury the next 10 minutes did not have room for. It did not get them past the 5th. The Regency Guard commander who found them wasn't a random trooper. He was waiting at the conduit's final junction, a broad, armor-plated Ashkar with command insignia burned into his forearm carapace, and 6 rifles fanned out behind him in a kill box that Naomi read, in the half-second she had to read it, as professionally set and impossible to walk through. "Regent Corvath will be pleased," the commander said, in the flat, unhurried tone of someone who had already won. A dead queen was a political inconvenience he could manage with a story. A queen who dies attempting escape, in the presence of a coalition soldier acting without authorization, that he can turn into whatever he needs it to be. I confess I did not expect the coalition to hand him the second half of that story so conveniently. My compliments on your timing, Sergeant. Naomi felt Vareth go rigid beside her, not with fear. She understood a half-second later, but with recognition. "Talvin," Vareth said, "you served my mother for 30 years. You carried me on your shoulders through the Ember Gardens when I was small enough to fit there. Your mother is dead, Ember Queen. Loyalty follows the throne, not the memory of who sat in it." But something in Talvin's carapace, Naomi caught it even without years of reading Ashkar biology, a flicker of dimming across his collar plates that didn't match the confidence in his voice, said the words cost him more than he wanted them to. One of the 6 troopers behind him, younger, his rifle already half raised toward Naomi rather than Vareth, said something low and urgent in Ashkar that Naomi's translator rendered a half-second late. Orders were orders. The sooner this was finished, the sooner they could clear the block and report a clean result. And Talvin silenced him with nothing more than a flat, sideways look that carried 30 years of rank behind it, and the trooper's rifle dropped an inch without another word being spoken. "Then follow the throne honestly," Vareth said, and her voice, even wrecked with 11 days of cold death, found something in that moment that made every one of the 6 rifles behind Talvin hesitate by a fraction. Ask yourself what a queen who dies escaping tells the Dominion about the regent who let her rot in her own grandmother's mining prison, rather than answer for his coup in open court. Ask what 6 of your own guards say, afterward in the barracks, about the night they killed a woman with her hands empty, because a human soldier with no orders and no backup thought she was worth walking into a kill box for. You know this story, Talvin. You have watched governments fall on smaller stories than that one. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. Naomi had time in it to run the math on her own next move, trauma kit. No weapon that mattered against 6 rifles. 1 option that was not a good option and 5 that were worse. And she had already decided which one she was going to take, had already shifted her weight to put her own body between the rifles and the queen, when Talvin made a small, precise gesture with 2 fingers that dropped every rifle in the corridor a fraction toward the floor. "The east collapse," he said, not looking at either of them now, looking instead at some point on the wall past Naomi's shoulder, "has an unstable section on the assay office side. It has been unstable since the fighting. Anyone attempting to move through that section quickly, at this hour, in a facility this dark, could very easily be lost in a further collapse before this patrol reached them. That would be a tragedy no one could be blamed for." His carapace flickered again, that same dimming, and Naomi understood, watching it, that she was looking at a man spending the last loyalty he had left on a single sentence. "I am going to walk my patrol back to the west stair now, Sergeant. I am going to take 4 minutes to do it. What happens in the east collapse during those 4 minutes is not something I will have witnessed." He turned. His 6 troopers turned with him, rifles coming fully up and away, and the last of them, the young one who had spoken up about orders, hesitated a half-step behind the others, looking back once at Vareth with an expression Naomi couldn't fully read in the dark, something that might have been shame or might have simply been fear of what Talvin would do to him later for the hesitation itself. Then he was gone too, boots falling into step with the rest, and the corridor behind Naomi and Vareth stood empty and dark, and exactly as impossible to cross safely as it had been a minute earlier, except now it was theirs. "Move," Naomi said, already hauling Verath's arm back over her shoulders, favoring the leg that had torn open in the flooded pipe without letting herself think about it yet. "Whatever that was, we don't get a second one." The east collapse, when they reached it, was worse than 4 minutes' warning had let Naomi imagine. A slope of broken concrete and twisted rebar rising into open sky, groaning audibly under its own settled weight, with the pale pre-dawn gray visible at the top of it like the only true exit left in the world. Naomi went up it first, testing each handhold, calling back the safe line for Verath to follow, and they were 2/3 of the way up, close enough to taste open air, when the whole slope shifted under them with a sound like the building finally deciding to finish falling down. Verath's feet went out from under her. Naomi's hand closed on her wrist a half-second before the drop would have taken her, and for 3 long seconds, the only thing keeping the Ember Queen of the Ashgar Dominion from going down into a collapsing sub-level prison was one human sergeant's grip, and the strength Naomi had built over 4 years of exactly this kind of impossible hold, braced against rebar that was cutting into her own forearm hard enough to draw blood she didn't have time to notice yet. Her decoder unit, still clipped to her vest, tore loose and vanished into the dark below them, and she let it go without a flicker of hesitation, because it had already done its job, and a piece of salvaged equipment was not a thing worth the half-second it would have cost to grab for it. "Let go," Verath said, low and urgent, her cold crystalled fingers slipping in Naomi's grip. "If we both go down, this was for nothing. Let go and get yourself out and tell someone the truth of what happened here. That is worth more than—" "No," Naomi said, and hauled, using the last of the strength in her shoulder and every hour of training that had ever taught her body what to do when logic said let go and something else said don't, and got Verath's other hand onto a fixed length of rebar, and then her knee, and then the two of them were both scrambling the last 4 meters up broken concrete into open air together, breathing hard, alive. With the gray light of a Cindermere dawn breaking over the slag fields, exactly the way Naomi had told Brant it would if everything went right. She keyed her handset with fingers that were shaking now that there was nothing left to hold onto but a radio. "Ferry to Vixen 1. I have the package. I need exfil, East Slag Field now." Brant's voice came back rough with relief he didn't bother hiding. "En route." 90 seconds. The Kestrel came in low and fast over the slag heaps, kicking up a curtain of gray dust, and Naomi got Verath aboard with the same economical, practiced motion she'd have used for any wounded soldier on any extraction in 4 years of exactly this work, except that this one made her hands unsteady in a way none of the others had, because this one had almost gone wrong in a corridor with 6 rifles, and had almost gone wrong on a collapsing slope, and hadn't, both times. By margins so thin Naomi didn't want to look at them too closely. The hatch sealed. The engines took the strain. Below them, the Cindermere works fell away into the dawn, and Regency patrol lights were converging on the slag field a full 90 seconds too late to matter. 90 seconds too late didn't hold for long. 2 Regency interceptor craft, light attack skiffs built for coastal patrol rather than dogfighting, lifted off from a pad Naomi hadn't marked on any schematic, banking hard toward the Kestrel's climb-out vector before the dust behind them had even settled. Brant saw them the same second the threat board lit orange. 2 bogies, 6 o'clock low, closing. His voice didn't rise, but his hands moved fast over the console, dumping altitude instead of climbing for it, dropping the Kestrel back down into the Slag Valley's broken terrain where a light shuttle's smaller signature could hide inside ground clutter. An attack skiff's targeting radar wasn't built to filter out. Hold on to something. The valley walls came up close on both sides, close enough that Naomi watched individual slag terraces flash past the viewport, and the hull groaned once, hard, as Brant threaded a gap between 2 spoil heaps that looked, for 1 full second, narrower than the Kestrel's own wingspan. Behind them, One of the skiffs opened up with a targeting pulse that painted the whole cabin red for half a heartbeat before Brant cut hard right into a side ravine, and the lock broke, the skiff's pilot pulling up rather than risk the same terrain at the same speed. "They're not committed," Brant said, eyes flicking between the threat board and the windscreen. "Patrol boats, not interceptors." They don't want to explain a dead coalition transponder to their own chain of command any more than Koss wants to explain us. He held the valley floor for another 90 seconds, dropping lower where the terrain allowed it, until the threat board's orange faded back to green, and the second skiff peeled off toward the Cindermere perimeter instead of following them out over open desert. "They're breaking off. Whoever's running that patrol doesn't have authorization to escalate past their own fence line." Small mercies. Naomi realized, watching the threat board clear, that she had been holding Vereth's uninjured hand through the entire run without deciding to, and that Vereth had been holding hers back just as hard. "You're clear," Brant said, "both of you." "Sit down before you fall down, Sergeant. You look like hell." He glanced back once over his shoulder as the Kestrel banked hard for altitude, taking in the state of her in a single practice sweep. The torn shin, the blood drying dark along her forearm where the rebar had opened it, the way her hands hadn't quite stopped shaking even though the danger behind them was already shrinking into the dawn haze. And something in his face eased for the first time since she'd climbed into his hangar the night before with a plan that had sounded, out loud, like a very good way to get them both killed. "For what it's worth," he added, quieter, "I wasn't sure you'd both make it back to this pickup point. I want you to know I'd have come anyway, third call or not, if you'd been 30 seconds later keying that radio." "I know," Naomi said. "That's why I asked you and not someone else." Naomi sat, finally letting the torn muscle in her shin announce itself now that there was nothing left to outrun. Across the narrow cabin, Vereth Sky Ilven sat wrapped in a thermal blanket with the last of the emergency compound working slowly through her system, her carapace plates beginning, faint and gradual, to shift back from cold slate toward something with warmth in it, and she watched Naomi with those black, faceted eyes for a long moment before she spoke. "You should not have come alone. There wasn't a version of this where I brought a wing," Naomi said. "The wing wasn't authorized. I was the only piece of it that could move without anyone's permission." "That is not what I meant." Vereth's dim plates flickered, warming by degrees. "I meant that you should not have had to decide alone that I was worth what it cost you to decide it. Your steward calculated 4 fleets of fuel against 1 queen and found the fuel heavier. You calculated something else alone in a hangar at night with no one to tell you that you were right to do it. That is a harder kind of courage than walking into a kill box," Sergeant Calder. "Walking into the kill box, I watched you do without hesitation. Making the decision that put you there, that, I think, cost you longer than the walking did." Naomi didn't have an answer for that wasn't going to cost her composure she needed for the next several hours, so she said nothing, and looked out the small viewport at the Cindermere Valley shrinking behind them, and let the silence hold until Brant's voice came back over the intercom, quieter now. "Naomi, Ops is hailing. They want to know why a training circuit flight plan is 15 minutes from Compact Joint Command with an unregistered passenger reading Ashkar biosignature." "Patch it through," Naomi said. It was not Group Captain Ondat's voice that answered when the channel opened. It was First Steward Ilvara Koss, and even filtered through a tinny cockpit speaker. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had already, in the space of one radio call, begun composing the report that would end a sergeant's career. "Sergeant Calder, you are ordered to divert to a secure holding pad. You are ordered to explain on the record exactly what you have done." "Copy, Steward," Naomi said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice came out steady. "I found the Ember Queen of the Ashkar Dominion in a cold death cell in a decommissioned mining prison 11 days after Regent Korvath's government reported her killed." I have full biometric confirmation of her identity, medical documentation of the cold death compound's efficacy, a copy of the Regent's own household sealed order suspending her mineral intake with no further authorization ever logged, and a corroborating statement from a Regency Guard commander who chose, in the moment it mattered, not to fire on an unarmed woman he had carried on his shoulders as a child. I'll give you all of it on the record, steward. Every piece. I'm not asking you to take my word for what I found. I'm bringing you the evidence and letting it argue its own case. The silence on the other end of the channel lasted long enough that Naomi thought the connection had dropped. Then Kasa's voice came back, and something in its careful flatness had shifted by a degree Naomi couldn't name yet but recognized as different. Divert to the secure pad, Sergeant, both of you. We will discuss the rest on the ground. The ground, when they reached it, was not the court-martial board Naomi had spent the flight back composing her testimony for. It was, at first, exactly as bad as she'd expected. Dr. Sethi meeting the Kestrel on the pad to take Verath straight into medical observation, and then 6 hours in a debrief room with a compact Joint Command legal officer, named Major Iben Fresh reading her the specific regulations she had broken, in order, while Group Captain Ondat sat at the far end of the table with an expression Naomi couldn't read and didn't try to. Because reading it wouldn't change anything that was about to happen to her. Article 11, Unauthorized Entry into Treaty-Restricted Territory, Fresh said, tapping each finger against the table as he went. Article 19, Misuse of a flight plan for purposes other than its filed intent. Article 31, Endangerment of a coalition asset, that's Chief Warrant Officer Brandt and the Kestrel both, without proper authorization. Article 44, Direct contravention of a standing directive after 2 explicit written denials from the ranking political authority on the matter. Do you dispute any of these, Sergeant? No, sir. You went alone. You didn't request a second retrieval technician. You didn't request an armed escort. You asked one pilot to risk his career and flew into hostile ground with a trauma kit and an experimental compound a xenobiologist wasn't authorized to release to you. That's correct, sir. Why alone? Because a request for a second technician or an armed escort would have gone through channels that already knew the answer was no, and I judged, correctly, sir, that the Queen didn't have the hours left for me to lose that argument twice. Naomi kept her hands flat on the table, kept her voice even. I'm not going to tell you I didn't understand the regulations I was breaking. I understood every one of them. I made the decision that a documented 11% probability of a living person in active cold death outweighed the risk to my own record. I'd make it again. Fresh flipped a page. Corporal Aldana's billet log shows no departure that night, but the hangar's own entry log shows a badge swipe under his credentials 6 minutes before yours. He let that sit on the table between them. Do you want to revise your account of who else was involved? Naomi kept her hands flat and her voice level. Corporal Aldana came to the hangar because my billet light hadn't come on and he knew where I'd be instead. He offered to come with me. I refused the offer and ordered him back to quarters before I told him one word of the plan beyond the fact that I had one. He tightened a strap on my kit that was sitting crooked, and he left. If that badge swipe is the extent of what you have on him, sir, that's the extent of what he did, stood in a doorway for 90 seconds and went home. That's a very precise account of 90 seconds, Sergeant. It's the 90 seconds I've had 6 days to think about, sir, because I don't want a corporal with a kid at home carrying weight that's mine to carry. She held Fresh's gaze. If this panel wants to pursue a complicity finding against Corporal Aldana, I'll testify to exactly what I just told you under oath, as many times as it takes. He didn't come. I made certain of that before I ever touched the kit. Fresh studied her for a moment, made a note she couldn't read upside down, and didn't raise Aldana's name again for the rest of the 6 hours. Then he set the tablet down flat on the table between them. Let me ask it differently, Sergeant. If I told you right now that this panel was certain to rule against you, full court-martial dishonorable discharge, the whole record, would you tell me you regretted the decision? No, sir. Not even a little. I'd regret costing Chief Warrant Officer Brand his career if it comes to that, because he didn't get to make the calculation the way I did. He made it on trust in me, which is a different kind of risk than the one I took. Naomi held his gaze. I would not regret going. I've turned that question over every hour I've had alone since the ramp closed on her 11 days before I went back for her, sir. It comes out the same every time. Fresh studied her for a moment longer than the question required, and then made one more note, and moved to the next article and the next, and it went on that way for 6 hours. Every regulation named, every answer given plainly, no minimizing, because Naomi had decided somewhere over the Cindermere Valley that there was no version of this where lying about any part of it made the truth she'd brought back matter less. What changed the room over the following days was not her testimony. It was Verath's. She gave it 3 days later, once the cold death compound had done its work and her carapace had come back fully to its banked, healthy orange, seated across from a full compact assembly review panel with a composure that made it hard, watching her, to remember she had spent 11 days dying in a cell 400 kilometers from where she now sat. She told them about the coup, about the 11 days, about Regent Corvath's calculated patience, not an execution order because an execution order left evidence, but a slow withholding of the one thing her biology needed, time to look, to any outside observer, like natural consequence rather than murder. She told them about the transmission she'd sent on a 40-second cycle for 3 nights running, gambling that somewhere in a coalition that had already written her off, one person's equipment and one person's training were good enough to catch an 11% probability and treat it as real. A panel member Naomi didn't recognize, a stout, gray-plated administrator from a species she couldn't place, pressed her on it directly. You are asking this panel to believe that a single sergeant's unauthorized action should retroactively be treated as sound policy. Is that not simply rewarding insubordination because it happened in this instance to succeed? I am asking this panel to understand the difference between insubordination and correction, Verath answered, without hesitation. Sergeant Calder did not disobey an order because obedience was inconvenient to her. She disobeyed an order because obeying it meant standing by, while a documented probability of a living person was left to die for the sake of a fuel contract. I would ask you to consider what your own doctrine trains your soldiers to become, if the lesson they take from this proceeding is that the correct response to that probability is to file a dissent and then do nothing further. You will find, I think, that the soldiers you most want in a crisis are exactly the ones capable of the judgment your question treats as a flaw. A second panel member, a narrow-faced coalition liaison Naomi recognized from personnel briefings but had never spoken to, leaned forward with the particular sharpness of someone who believed she had found the crack in the argument. And if the next sergeant's judgment is wrong, if the next unauthorized retrieval costs a treaty, and the person retrieved turns out to have been exactly as dead as the report claimed, are we to treat every future Sergeant Calder as correct simply because this one happened to be? No, Verath said flatly, with no softening in it at all. You are to build a doctrine that requires the judgment to be checked, documented, and answered for, as this panel is, in fact, currently doing to the sergeant in question, at real cost to her career and record. That is not the same thing as a doctrine that forbids the judgment from being exercised at all. I am not asking you to reward recklessness. I am asking you to stop mistaking caution for safety. Your prior doctrine was not safe. It simply moved the risk from your compact's political, standing onto the bodies of the people you had already decided not to count. The panel called First Steward Koss to testify on the 4th hour of that same session, and Naomi watched her stand at the witness rail with the same unbroken composure she'd carried into every meeting Naomi had ever had with her. and answer the panel's questions about her original denial without once trying to make it sound better than it had been. "I stand by the reasoning I applied at the time," Koss told the panel. "Given the information available to me, an 11% confidence signal, an active treaty 6 days from ratification, and no corroborating intelligence, I judged the political and material cost of an unauthorized incursion to outweigh the probability of a viable rescue. I would apply the same reasoning again to the same set of facts, in isolation. What I did not adequately weigh, and what this proceeding has made unavoidable for me to weigh now, is the second-order cost of a doctrine that treats an 11% probability of a living person as functionally equivalent to zero. Sergeant Calder's own signals training exists precisely because 11% is not zero. I built my calculus on a category error I did not recognize as an error until she proved it was one. At a cost to herself, I was not the one who had to pay. It was as close to a public admission of fault as Naomi had ever heard a compact official make, and she watched it land across the panel table the way a held breath finally let go, and understood, watching it, that whatever the panel ultimately decided about her own conduct, the doctrine itself was not going to survive this hearing intact. Group Captain Ondat testified last in the same session under her own name and rank, and did not soften anything either. She confirmed, on the record, that she had known her sergeant was planning some form of unauthorized action, that she had deliberately declined to ask for details she could have compelled with a single direct order, and that she would make the identical choice again if given the chance to relive that corridor conversation. "I am aware that testimony constitutes an admission of dereliction on my own part," she told the panel, before any of them could raise it. "I am not asking to be excused from that. I am telling you plainly, because Sergeant Calder told this panel the truth plainly, and I am not going to be the officer in this room who does otherwise." Naomi, watching from the gallery seats reserved for witnesses awaiting further questioning, understood in that moment that she was not, whatever else happened to her own record, going to walk out of this proceeding alone. And she told them, in the same flat, deliberate register she'd used to describe her own dying, exactly what First Steward Koss's calculation had cost, and exactly what it would have meant, going forward, for every future ally of the coalition who found themselves inconvenient to a treaty. "Your steward's arithmetic was not unreasonable," Verath told the panel. "4 fleets of fuel is a great deal to set against one queen with no throne left to sit on. I do not ask you to find that arithmetic monstrous. I ask you to understand what it teaches every smaller power watching how the coalition behaves when the cost of keeping a promise to a person, rather than a government, becomes inconvenient. You will find, I think, that the number of allies willing to trust you with their lives is smaller than the number willing to trust you with a shipping contract." Sergeant Calder understood that difference 11 days before the rest of your compact did. She acted on it alone, at personal cost that I understand has not yet been resolved. I would ask this panel to consider what kind of coalition it wishes to be remembered as the one that calculated me not worth saving, or the one that quietly corrected the calculation once a soldier who had never met me made a different one, and was right. The panel deliberated for 4 days. Naomi spent them on administrative leave, in quarters, doing the specific, grinding work of not knowing, which she had never found easier than the physical kind of hard. Brant came by twice with food she didn't eat and didn't ask him to leave, and told her, on the second visit, that half the flight line had heard some version of the story by now, and none of the versions he'd overheard made her sound like she'd done anything but the job right, which wasn't the same as knowing what the panel would rule, he admitted, but it was something. 2 of her own squadron's junior technicians, neither of whom she'd trained personally, left a note under her door on the 3rd day that said only that they'd refiled her old descent as a training case study, because if the regulations changed, they wanted to be able to point at the paperwork that had said it first. Corporal Aldana came by on the fourth day, off duty, and didn't say much of anything, just sat with her for an hour in the kind of silence that didn't need filling, and told her on his way out that his daughter had asked him what a rescue technician did for a living, and he'd finally had an answer that didn't sound like a training manual. Even Dr. Sethai sent word through the medical wing's internal channel, a single line with no signature required. The compound held. She's stable. Whatever happens to you, that part worked. It was, Naomi thought, a strange kind of comfort to be assembling piecemeal, not vindication, not yet, but evidence that whatever the panel decided, the 4 days hadn't been spent entirely alone. Andach came by once on the third day and sat across from her without speaking for almost a full minute before she finally said the thing Naomi had been waiting, without admitting it to herself, to hear. "I didn't ask you what you were planning that night in the corridor," Andach said. "I want you to understand that was a choice, not an oversight. I've commanded rescue technicians for 11 years, Sergeant. I have learned that the ones worth having are the ones who occasionally make me choose between the letter of an order and the reason the order exists in the first place. I made my choice that night. I'm not going to pretend it was an easy one, and I'm not going to pretend I know yet what it's going to cost either of us. But I want you to hear it from me before the panel rules. Whatever they decide, I would make the same choice again. And I told the panel exactly that, under my own name, in writing." The panel's ruling, when it came, was not the outright vindication Naomi had let herself imagine in her weaker moments, nor the court-martial she had genuinely believed, walking into that debrief room 6 days earlier, was the more likely outcome. It was something narrower, and she came to understand over the following weeks, truer than either. Her formal dissent was struck from adverse status and reclassified as a documented, correct assessment, which meant it would follow her not as a black mark, but as a footnote future review boards would have to actually read. Her unauthorized action itself was not excused. The panel was explicit about that, unwilling to set a precedent that any soldier could simply override a lawful order whenever their own judgment disagreed with it. And she accepted a formal reprimand and a temporary grounding from combat rescue rotation that would sting for a year regardless of what else happened. But the third finding was the one that mattered, the one Koss herself, stone-faced, read into the record in a compact-wide directive 4 weeks later. That the standing doctrine governing political liability retrievals, the quiet, bureaucratic category under which Verath Sky Ilven had nearly died, the category that let a coalition weigh a living person's rescue against a treaty's convenience and call the weighing final, was suspended pending full review, effective immediately, network-wide, across every coalition command that had ever used it. "It will not change quickly," Koss told her, in a final meeting neither of them had asked for but both of them, Naomi suspected, needed. "Institutions do not change quickly. But it will change, Sergeant, because you made it impossible to pretend the old doctrine cost nothing. I want you to know I still believe my original calculation was defensible. I also want you to know that I have spent 4 weeks unable to stop hearing the Ember Queen's testimony in my own voice, and that is not a comfortable thing for a steward to admit. You did not talk me into anything. You simply made the cost of the old answer impossible to look away from. That is, I am told, a very human kind of victory." The formal protest from Regent Korvath's government arrived 8 days after the panel's ruling went public, a diplomatic cable, routed through the same treaty desk that had once weighed Verath's life against 4 fleets of fuel, demanding Sergeant Naomi Calder be extradited to Ashgar jurisdiction to stand trial for unauthorized incursion, unlawful entry into a sovereign detention facility, and the abduction of a state prisoner, and threatening, in the same cable, to suspend all Heartstone deliveries under the Cindermere Accords if the demand went unanswered within 30 days. For those 30 days, Naomi understood for the first time what it meant to be the actual, physical stakes of a treaty, rather than the person arguing about one. Andach told her plainly, At a briefing, Naomi wasn't officially cleared to attend, but attended anyway because Ondat left the door open on purpose. That Joint Command's political desk was split roughly down the middle, half of them arguing that surrendering one disgraced sergeant was a cheap price for 4 fleets of fuel. The exact arithmetic cost had once applied to Verath, come back around to be applied to the technician who'd broken it. It was Koss, of all people, who ended the argument, standing before the same review panel that had ruled on Naomi's conduct weeks earlier and reading into the record a single line the Compact's diplomatic corps would quote for years afterward. That a coalition which had just formally acknowledged the wrongness of trading a living person for a fuel contract could not, in the same season, trade a different living person for the same contract's continuation, without making every word of its own prior ruling a lie it told itself for convenience. The extradition demand was refused, formally, in writing, within the week. Regent Korvath's government did not suspend the Heartstone shipments. Word reached Naomi later that 3 of his own household lords had counseled him against it, on the grounds that a regent who picked a fight over one captured sergeant was inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny his own withholding order could not survive. Word reached Naomi in pieces over the following months of what became of Regent Korvath, that the evidence of a deliberate withholding, laid out in compact medical documentation and corroborated by a Regency Guard commander's own sworn statement, had done in the Dominion's High Court what a second coup never could have. Turned 3 of Korvath's own household lords against him inside a season, not out of loyalty to Verath, but out of a colder calculation of their own, that a regent who would let a cousin freeze to death by patient neglect was not a man whose promises anyone's household could safely trust. Korvath was not executed. He was, Verath told her later, exiled to a mining concession on the Dominion's coldest moon, a piece of poetic arithmetic Naomi suspected the Queen had arranged personally and did not ask her to confirm. Verath Sky Ilven did not reclaim the Ashgar throne in the months that followed, not directly. That fight, she told Naomi plainly on the morning she shipped out for coalition space to build the political case that would, eventually, unseat her cousin's chosen successor through evidence and testimony rather than through a second coup. That fight was hers to have, on her own terms with her own people, and she had no intention of letting a human soldier's rescue be mistaken for a human solution. But she came to the hangar before she left, found Naomi elbow-deep in the same Kestrel's undercarriage she'd been working on the night this had started, and stood there long enough that Naomi finally set down her tools and looked up. "I did not thank you properly," Verath said. "There has not been a private moment for it, in weeks of panels and reprimands and doctrine reviews. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I am choosing to." The Ember Queen's carapace burned steady and warm in the hangar light, the deep-banked orange Naomi had first seen in the Ember Gardens weeks before the coup and had been afraid, for 11 days, she would never see again. "You should understand what you actually did," Sergeant called her, "because I do not think the panel's ruling captured it, and I do not think you have let yourself sit with it yet. You did not simply save my life. You proved, to a woman who was ready to die believing it, that being inconvenient to someone's calculation is not the same as being worthless. I have carried that belief my whole reign, quietly, the way every ruler of a small dominion carries it, that we survive only as long as we are useful to someone larger. You are the first person who ever showed me, with your own body, in a cell at 3 in the morning, that it was not true. I intend to rule differently because of it, if I ever get the chance to rule again. That is what you bought, alone, in a hangar at night, when you decided a 90-second countdown on a dropship ramp was not the end of the story." She left before Naomi could find an answer for that, the way she had left the debrief panel's testimony without waiting for applause, because that, too, Naomi understood, watching her go, was the register of someone who had learned to make her exits before the room could make her something she hadn't chosen to be. Naomi went back to the undercarriage. The fuel line seal still needed checking, and there was a flight in 9 days, supervised this time. A training rotation with a full wing behind her instead of a stolen plan, and a pilot willing to gamble his career on hers. And grounding or no grounding, reprimand or no reprimand, the job was still the job. Read the signal everyone else called noise. Go get the person the math said wasn't worth going for and bring them home. 10 months later, when her grounding lifted and her name came back onto the active rescue rotation board, the first thing Group Captain Ondat handed her wasn't a mission packet. It was a copy of the revised compact-wide retrieval doctrine. The political liability category struck out entirely and replaced with a single new clause that Naomi read twice before she understood that the drafting language, careful and bloodless as it was, had her own dissent's original wording buried inside it almost verbatim. Pinned to the front page, in handwriting she recognized from a single hanger farewell 10 months earlier, was a short note that had traveled through 3 sets of diplomatic pouches to reach her. Vereth Sky Ilven had been formally recognized, 3 weeks earlier, as Ember Queen Regent of the restored Ashkar Court, and the first act of her reign, before any coronation ceremony, had been to sign a standing invitation for a certain human sergeant to visit the Ember Gardens again, this time through the front gate. She used the invitation 4 weeks later, on a supervised diplomatic rotation Ondat, had arranged with a straight face, and no explanation the rest of the wing was ever given. The Ember Gardens looked nothing like they had the last time Naomi had seen them from 100 meters up, watching a coup take a palace apart in real time. They were full now, restored court staff moving between beds of heat-blooming flora that opened their petals toward banked warmth rather than sunlight, and at the center of it, receiving visitors without an honor guard between herself and the gate, exactly as she had the first time Naomi had ever seen her, stood Vereth Sky Ilven, her carapace burning a deep, unbroken orange that held steady even as she crossed the courtyard herself to meet the human sergeant at the threshold, instead of waiting to be brought to her. "You came through the front gate," Vereth said, as promised. "Wasn't sure the invitation was still good this far out." "It will always be good," Sergeant called her. "That is not a courtesy. It is a debt, and I intend to keep paying it for considerably longer than either of us will find comfortable." Something moved through her plating that Naomi had learned, over the better part of a year of intermittent correspondence, to read as genuine warmth rather than diplomatic performance. "Talvin asked to be remembered to you, incidentally. He was reinstated to my personal guard 3 months ago, once the court finished satisfying itself that a man who defies an unjust order at personal risk is not, in fact, a security liability. I understand your own compact reached a similar conclusion about you, eventually, though it took them rather longer to say so plainly. They said it plainly enough in the end. They said it in the language institutions use, which is never quite plain, but I have learned to translate it." Vereth turned, walking beside her now rather than facing her, the two of them moving together down a gravel path between the heat-blooming beds, the way Naomi remembered her walking a supply line 6 weeks before everything had come apart. "I have kept the log page, you know, the one you copied out of a guard station in 11 seconds while running for both our lives. I had it mounted, framed, in a small room off my private chambers that no visiting dignitary will ever be shown, not as a trophy. As a reminder, on the days when ruling well feels harder than it is worth, of exactly what a patient, careful, entirely rational man's cruelty looks like when you strip away every word he'd have used to excuse it. Suspend, pending further order. 2 words. No further order ever needed to come because the 2 words had already done the work." She stopped at the courtyard's far wall, where the ground fell away toward the valley beyond the palace grounds, the whole restored city visible in the late light. I do not intend to become a ruler who needs 2 words like that to hide behind. You are, in no small part, the reason I understand the difference now between hiding behind patience and simply being cruel slowly. Naomi stood beside her a while, looking out over a city that 11 months ago had been a coup in progress and was now, improbably, just a city again, going about its evening the way cities did when nobody in them was currently being hunted. For what it's worth, she said eventually, I'd make the same call again. Every part of it, even the parts that cost me. I know, Vereth said. That is precisely why I trust you with the front gate, and not merely the maintenance conduit behind it. Naomi flew back to Compact Joint Command 2 days later, and reported to the flight line the following morning exactly on schedule, and found the fuel line seal on her assigned Kestrel already checked and logged by someone else's hand, which meant nothing except that the work still had to be hers regardless, because that was the job, not the one rescue that made the record books, but the next flight, and the one after it, and the ordinary, unglamorous maintenance that made either of them possible at all. Naomi read the doctrine memo once more that evening, folded it into her breast pocket where the old descent used to sit heaviest, and went to check the fuel line seal on a shuttle that had a flight in 9 days. She had a year of restricted rotation behind her, and a permanent file that carried both the reprimand and the vindication forever, tangled together the way the truth of that night would probably always be tangled, reckless and correct in the same breath, insubordinate and right for exactly the same reasons. She found she could live with that. She tightened the seal, wiped her hands on the rag, and did not look up again until the work was done.